you in Focus with Ijaz here. Our top story this evening is the verbal sparring between U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and representatives of China and Russia at the UN Security Council. The spat happened last Friday when Blinken warned that Washington would push back forcefully when we see countries undermine the international order, pretend that the rules we have all agreed to don't exist, or simply violate them at will. Because for the system to deliver, all countries must abide by it and put in the work for its success. It would appear to be a jab at the Trump administration. Blinken also said, I know that some of our actions in recent years have undermined the rules-based order and led others to question whether we are still committed to it. Rather than take our word for it, we ask the world to judge our commitment by our actions. Blinken's counterparts, Foreign Ministers Wang Yi of China and Sergei Lavrov of Russia, took their own diplomatic swipes at the United States, accusing it of hypocrisy and of defining international rules in terms designed to assert Western dominance in the world. Wang Yi spoke of countries who view the international rules as patent or privilege of the few. Interestingly, the exchanges came at a UNSC meeting convened by China and held virtually via video conference link. And ironically, the theme of the meeting was multilateral cooperation against the pandemic, global warming, and other common threats. The exchange of barbs seemed like a rematch of what happened at Anchorage in Alaska in March, where Blinken and U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan had a pre-meeting heated exchange with Wang Yi and the Chinese Communist Party Foreign Affairs Chief Yang Jiechi. According to the New York Times, and I quote from what the Times said, although the terms and tone used in the Friday meeting were more diplomatic, the differences were stark in the worldviews espoused by Mr. Blinken and his counterparts. Those differences suggested that the gridlock among the big powers of the Security Council would not ease anytime soon, unquote. To discuss the rising tension between the U.S. and China combined, I'm joined by Cheng Xizhong, a former senior colonel in the PLA and visiting professor at Southwest University of Political Science and Law, and Dr. Kamran Bokhari, Director of Analytical Development at the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy in Washington, D.C. Thank you to both panelists. Let me begin with Kamran Bokhari here. Kamran, give me a sense of what do you think of this? I mean, it seems, as I said, the tone might be more diplomatic, milder, but essentially rematch from what happened at Anchorage in March.
I think, Ijaz, the international community needs to be able to come to terms with this new reality where the diplomatic niceties or the decorum through which U.S. and other major powers have spoken to each other publicly in such fora are going to be less and less something that we'll be seeing. And we'll be seeing more of this acrimonious exchanges. It's a sign of the times. It has very little to do with the Trump administration and how it acted, and in terms of the disregard or the of the international rules-based order. But it has more to do with the fact that we're in an age where powers like China and Russia are increasingly challenging the United States. And so there is the real geopolitical, physical challenge. And then once it translates into discourse, this is what it looks like. And so I think that this is going to be the new norm moving forward, given the fact that the multiple centers of power, in this case, Beijing and Moscow, but others as well, will increasingly at least verbally challenging the United States, because that's where we are geopolitically speaking. The days when the Chinese and the Russians would sort of be muted in the way they critique the United States are behind us. China is becoming increasingly confident, increasingly bellicose. The Russians are also, while their power is waning, but they want to be able to at least tell their public and the world that they're still a great power. And when you can't do physical acts. But none of these powers want to be able to actually get into situations where there is like a physical clash and leads to deterioration of actual relationships. So this is where you come out and you look tough. So I think we're going to see more of this tough rhetoric from both sides.
It's interesting, Kamran, you say this, because leaving aside, obviously, the reasons for tensions, there was a sense, I know clearly it proved wrong, but there was a sense that the Trump administration, for instance, Donald Trump himself or Mike Pompeo, they had, they would formulate whatever they needed to say in very strident and fairly often non-diplomatic way of saying it. And so there was a sense that with Biden administration, tensions notwithstanding, the level of discourse, or the tone and tenor of the discourse, if you will, would change and become more savvy. That does not seem to have happened, as you have mentioned. It's interesting also that both at Anchorage as well as here at this meeting, which was convened by China, the tone was set by the U.S. side. If you go back to the Anchorage meeting, this was a pre-meeting sort of, where normally you would exchange pleasantries before the media, before you start talking tough behind closed doors. The tone was set by Blinken and Sullivan. And then, of course, the Chinese side, especially, Yang Jiechi, gave a long sermon, obviously accusing the United States of any number of things. So is this a kind of, how should I put it? Is this like a Twitter kind of exchanges happening at fora where, normally diplomats would be a little more cautious in the way that they would formulate what they needed to say?
So there are a couple of things here. Yes, I think that the situation is as such where the United States feels the need to signal that, look, there are certain red lines, and this rules-based order, which the Biden administration has, publicly stated that it wants to go back to. So there's a need to signal to both the Russians and the Chinese that is going to be the case, that this administration is going to be serious, that if you got used to what was happening under the Trump administration, well, guess again, it's not going to happen. And so there is that. I think the Biden administration feels the need to say those things. Number two is that the even Chinese behavior and Russian behavior has become far more assertive. And so how do you respond if you're the United States and you want to use diplomatic channels to be able to send these messages without necessarily going down the route of flexing muscle, if you will, actual muscle in terms of either military or economic means, then this is how you do it. And so I think there are a number of stimuli that are propelling the Biden administration to adopt this tone that you've identified. Part of it has to do with saying whatever happened in the last 4 years, well, consider that as sort of like a blip. That's not the way we operate. And so we want to be able to return to the international rules-based order, and we're very serious about it. So that's number one. Number two is a sort of more of domestic politics, where this administration wants to be able to let everybody know at home, especially its opponents, and given the nature of the previous election and the outcome and the circumstances, it wants to telegraph at home that, look, we're not going to be a pushover, because that was the message of the former president when he was campaigning, that, if you elect the Democrats, if Biden comes into power, then China will walk over the United States, Russia will, do this, and so on and so forth. So there is that effort as well. And there's also then the general messaging to the world, where you let them know, look, where this isn't, America is back, to sort of quote the president. And so this is the way to signal all of that. And I think that these are the stimuli, the various stimuli that are shaping this kind of behavior and this type of discourse and the high-pitched tone, if you will.
Right. I mean, I think what I find more plausible is the domestic politics angle here, because the rest of it can also be said in a more diplomatic way. But let me pull in Senior Colonel Cheng into this discussion. Senior Colonel Cheng, what do you make of this increasingly sort of belligerent tone by the United States and equally belligerent sort of, comebacks by the Chinese?
The United States has been practicing unilateralism in the past few decades. And the United States will strike any country it wants to strike. And it will sanction any country it wants to sanction. Now there is a change. The United States, there is a change in wording. Now the United States suddenly proposes a multilateral world. And it seems America is supporting multilateralism. I believe this is closely related to the rapid decline of the American strength status and to the rapid rise of China's strength status, and also related to the strong cooperation between China and Russia. Therefore, no matter in the Asia-Pacific region or in the whole world, the United States no longer has the ability to speak and act exclusively. It needs to draw some countries together to form an alliance. In the bilateral strategic dialogue, the United States used to speak on the basis of strength. Now the United States is gradually losing this advantage. In terms of strength, China is getting closer to the United States, which is basically equal to the United States. Now China's position of power increases. It becomes more and more confident. China is becoming more and more confident when dealing with the United States. And at present in the Asia-Pacific region, there is a good situation of strong cooperation between China and Russia, which the United States believes is a serious challenge to its dominance in the Asia-Pacific region. Under the cover of multilateral cooperation, the United States is trying to get support from the West in an attempt to form a new 8-nation allied force. That was the history, and has drawn up some countries in the Asia-Pacific region to form also alliance, so as to attack and suppress China and Russia. In the view of the United States, China's peaceful rise and the growth of emerging economies such as China, Russia, are destroying the world order. The United States is trying to maintain its world hegemony status forever. America would like to maintain the world hegemony status forever by attacking and suppressing China and Russia. Here, I would like to solemnly warn the United States that today's China is no longer the one 120 years ago. And the United States would not succeed in its 8-power allied force plot. It is also a daydream to form alliance against China in the Pacific region. Now the United States suddenly proposes to engage in multilateral world. However, if there are no China and Russia in this multilateral world, the narrow sense of multilateralism is no different from group politics.
Okay. So you're basically saying that China is in absolutely no mood to allow the United States to push it. Now, a final question, Senior Colonel Cheng. This session that we're talking about, where there was this exchange, it was held the same week that Blinken had a meeting with the foreign ministers of the group of 7 nations. This was in Britain. And once again, he emphasized what he described as the importance of defending democratic values and open societies. Now, this is a signal that the Biden administration has been sending to China and Russia, challenging them on human rights, disinformation, and various other issues. Now, interestingly enough, yesterday, the United States stood solidly, according to the U.S. statement, stood solidly behind Israel, even as Israel committed war crimes in Gaza and elsewhere against the Palestinians. So it seems to me that the Biden administration, in talking about democratic values and open societies, is cherry picking who it wants to criticize, which is China and Russia, and who it would support, i.e. Israel, or for that matter, India, and India's suppression of Kashmiris in occupied Kashmir.
Actually, the so-called democracy and all these theories of America have two double standards. Now, in the Asia-Pacific region, I have noticed that the United States is trying to win over some countries to form alliance against China. And but more and more countries in the region have made it clear that they would not join the American alliance against China. For example, the Sri Lankan president and defense minister has expressed very firmly that Sri Lanka would not, join any alliance. Sri Lanka adheres to independent foreign policy, and so Sri Lanka would not. Also, Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh are China's traditional friendly neighbors and have always maintained a high degree of vigilance against the U.S. plot against China. So I see in the Asia-Pacific region, and China and many countries have reached a very important consensus that they should jointly resist the actions of the world power to piece together military alliance and engage in hegemonism in the region, and jointly safeguard regional peace and stability. So far as India is concerned, India is a very big power, is the main country in South Asia. So far as the population is concerned, the size is concerned. But I have always a question mark about whether it will join the American alliance against China or not. In my opinion, the contradictions between between India and the United States is the main thing, is fundamental. And the cooperation between India and America is mutual utilization. So since its independence, India has been adhering more or less to an independent foreign policy. And recently, American warships entered India's exclusive economic zone, and the Indian Foreign Ministry expressed concern. I strongly believe that as a country that has been independent for more than 70 years, India will have a clear understanding of the strategic plot of the world power in the region. So I feel the so-called Quad mechanism, there is the 4 countries, the United States, Japan, India, and Australia. I think that is nothing, only in name. The United States regards, the main reason is that the United States regards itself as the eldest brother or even father, and all the other countries as little brothers or sons. However, India is very ambitious, and India does not want to be Americans' little brother or American son. That is my point. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much. That was Senior Colonel Cheng Xizhong speaking with us. Let me go back to Dr. Kamran Bokhari. Kamran, give me your impression of what Senior Colonel Cheng said, and then we'll move to Biden administration signaling to Russia.
So, Ijaz, that's that I was making earlier was sort of based off of sort of this Chinese new, if you will, attitude, which was exemplified by Mr. Cheng, in that there is this sort of sharp rhetoric also coming from the Chinese, as well, more so from the Chinese than the Russians. I mean, it is a lot of rhetoric, but it's not really based on a whole lot of reality. Number one, the powers in the Asia-Pacific region do not want to be brought under Chinese hegemony. They do not want to be seen as being pushed around by China. So the idea that somehow the alliance is faltering is wishful thinking on the part of Beijing. So long as China is perceived by powers like South Korea, Japan, Australia, Indonesia, the Philippines, and Taiwan as a threatening force. And it has to do with the nature of the Chinese state, which everyone knows is a very autocratic regime. The Americans don't need to be able to go and fetch friends, if that's what Mr. Cheng was saying, because these powers will rely on the United States. They have nobody else to rely on. And therefore, it's not the U.S. that's on the defensive; it's the Chinese that are on the defensive. As for India,
but Kamran, let me interject here. I mean, I get your point, but I find it somewhat interesting that you refer to this in relation to the Chinese system, because I think if we look at a democratic United States and how the U.S. has acted as a hegemon in the Western Hemisphere, in relation to Mexico, for instance, in relation to countries of Latin America, the U.S. foreign policy has been extremely ruthless, and that had nothing to do with the system inside, but that had everything to do with the fact that hegemons do not like peer competition. They want to have a predominance within their sphere of influence, and that's exactly what the U.S. did. And I believe that going by structural realism, that's exactly how the Chinese will go in their sphere of influence.
I don't disagree with you. All I'm saying over here is that the perceptions, I was, if you will, responding to the perceptions shared by Mr. Cheng, and which represent the thinking of the Chinese state. So I'm saying that there is the structural realism, and then there is the perception that is being shaped that somehow the United States is losing, and the Chinese are gaining, and I'm saying that is more rhetoric than reality. As far as Latin America is concerned and the Western Hemisphere is concerned, yes, hegemons are ruthless, but then there are hegemons and hegemons. The United States is not Britain. The United States is not France of the centuries past. The United States is a very different global power, imperial power. It does not have colonies, and the United States does abide by principles. So if you're the Philippines, if you're the Australians, if you're the South Koreans and the Japanese, who would you want to be able to align yourself with, given that structural realism does not give you too many choices? And so that's the issue that I'm trying to address over here. Yes, I mean, look, at the end of the day, great powers do what they must. All powers, small or big, do what they must in order to survive. They have imperatives, and yes, they have constraints. But what I'm trying to say here is that there's that reality, and there is rhetoric. We can, keep talking about, how the United States credibility is gone. That's what the Chinese love to say. But I wanted to point out that the Chinese are telegraphing far more than actually doing stuff, and they're basically inflating their worth based on GDP numbers. And everybody who knows economics and finance and international trade knows that GDP numbers alone can be very misleading.
Okay, that's a fair comment, Dr. Kamran Bokhari. Stay with me. As I said earlier, we're going to move now to U.S.-Russia relations. And for that, joining me is Mark Sleboda, a Moscow-based international affairs and security analyst. Mark Sleboda, thank you for being on the program. So we're discussing what happened at the UNSC meeting, which was convened by China, where Russia was represented by Sergei Lavrov. So, there's also been a clear signal from the Biden administration with Antony Blinken visiting Ukraine. And while he was there, he pledged support for its fight against a Russian-backed insurgency, which has already claimed about 13,000 lives. And earlier, President Biden had also made some rather undiplomatic remarks about Vladimir Putin, calling him a killer. So give me your sense of where you think U.S.-Russia relations are headed.
It's like, the U.S. With Biden as a renewed head of, what is widely acknowledged as U.S.-led Western global hegemony, seeking to confront with Russia, with China, with Iran, to push this hegemonic confrontation with countries that are not aligned with it. And Russia is certainly one of the foremost among those. We've seen multiple new rounds of sanctions. In the last few years, we've seen some 80-some rounds of unilateral sanctions levered by the United States against Russia, and hardly just Russia. I mean, the U.S. is even sanctioning its own ostensible allies like Turkey and Germany at the moment when they show the slightest amount attempt of restoring some amount of sovereignty and foreign policy independence away from the United States, particularly, of course, when that is doing business with Russia or with China. So I do not see U.S.-Russia relations as improving in the slightest.
Right. But here's the thing, Mark Sleboda. Lots of analysts, and not just in the U.S., but also in Europe, especially in countries bordering the Russian Federation, Estonia, Latvia, and others, that talk about the fact that Moscow is trying to regain its hegemonic influence in what used to be its near abroad. So in terms of how bigger powers operate, the Russian Federation is acting in ways that are no different from how the United States operates.
Disagree with that entirely. If we take a look at every one of these matters of concern, again, by countries that are already aligned with U.S.-led Western global hegemony that you are mentioning, whether we're talking Ukraine or Georgia, what we see is Russian always, I think to a fault, only reacting to U.S. aggression and meddling in the region when they try to extend their global sphere of influence right up against Russia's borders. And in particular, the U.S.-backed putsch in Ukraine, the regime's there assault on its own people as it still 7 years later attempts to cement its control over the entire country, has cost some 15,000 lives, which can be, of course, directly laid at the blame of the regime in Kiev and its U.S. backers.
Okay. Since I'm running out of time also, let me quickly go back to Dr. Kamran Bokhari. Kamran, you heard what Mark Sleboda is saying. So give me your view of what Russia intends to do in terms of increasing its influence, and also what Mark is saying, in terms of Moscow only reacting to what the U.S. is doing.
So Ijaz, and with all due respect to Mark, I really disagree. Look, it's not the United States' fault that the Russians are losing control over their periphery. The Ukrainians don't want to be, bullied around by Moscow, and the Georgians remember the 2008 war. All along the periphery, the peoples of, various peoples of the former Soviet Union are seeing Russia as a waning power. Russia is a waning power. It can go and say, okay, it's been happening because the U.S. is sanctioning them unilaterally, multilaterally, whatever the case may be. But the fact of the matter is, even if you take Central Asia, for example, the United States isn't there. Okay, that's one area of the world that the United States has not been able to, influence. And that's where, Russian power is waning, and the Chinese are filling that vacuum. They're coming in. The Chinese have far more cash than the Russians. The Russians can keep blaming it because, it's because of the sanctions. No, it's because of the political economic realities at home that are constraining Russian power. And the people in those regions, whether it's the Kazakhs or the Ukrainians or the Georgians, they are afraid of Russia. And so they have nobody to turn to other than the United States. And the United States will not sit back and just say, okay, we're going to be a neutral observer here. On the contrary, the United States will help. And so, there needs to be sort of proportion in terms of, you can keep blaming the United States for all your miseries. But the fact of the matter is that there are structural problems with the Putin regime. And now with Putin's best days behind him, the question in the minds of those at the Kremlin is, what next? How do we maintain ourselves? They certainly don't want to become a second-rate power, but that is the trend line. Can they reverse it? Well, it remains to be seen. What can they do? What are their options? How much money do they have? Are they willing to go to war? Ukraine is a perfect example. The Russians are trying to show that they still can influence Ukraine, but they're not. There was all this media uproar recently about war games and the Russians deploying forces in the eastern part of Ukraine or building up on their border, but nothing came of it because you can shape perceptions. But when the rubber meets the road, that's a completely different story. I don't think that the Russians want to be able to use military power. They just saw what happened in Nagorno-Karabakh when the Turks took advantage of the weakening of the Russian footprint, and they helped the Azerbaijanis reshape the political landscape of the South Caucasus. After 1994, this was unprecedented, taking territories Russia then had to accept.
Right. I've just run out of time, but very quickly, Mark, you want to come back, but no more than a couple of minutes.
I have to respectfully disagree, of course, with my colleague Bokhari. It is, of course, rather amusing to hear someone with a declining hegemony, with the Biden regime presiding over the deterioration of their own power, their withdrawal in defeat from Central Asia, from Afghanistan, actually, after a 20-year attempt to build power in that neighborhood, and of course, attempt to speak in generalizations. Ukrainians. My wife is Crimean. I've got family all over eastern Ukraine. The U.S. has backed political forces in that country and in Georgia that, want to dovetail with the U.S.'s own interests at the cost of lives of those in the country that do not.
Okay. Thank you. That was Mark Sleboda. Thank you also to Dr. Kamran Bokhari for his insights. We shall take a short break and return to discuss the ongoing back-channel talks between Iran and Saudi Arabia, a process both sides have now acknowledged officially. Stay with us. Welcome back to In Focus. On Monday, Iran confirmed publicly for the first time that it is in talks with its regional arch-rival Saudi Arabia, saying it would do what it could to resolve issues between them. De-escalation of tensions between the two Muslim countries in the Persian Gulf region is in the interest of both nations and the region. Foreign Ministry spokesperson Saeed Khatibzadeh said in a televised weekly news conference. Earlier, Iraqi and Saudi officials had confirmed that both sides were talking and exploring ways to normalize relations. Ambassador Riyadh Krimli, head of policy planning at Saudi Arabia's foreign ministry, last week told Reuters that talks between Saudi Arabia and Iran were aimed at reducing regional tension. He said it was too early to judge the outcome and Riyadh wanted to see verifiable deeds. Iran and Saudi Arabia have been locked in a rivalry that has played out in proxy conflicts across the region, from Yemen to Syria to Iraq. The two countries cut diplomatic ties in 2016 after an angry mob ransacked and torched the Saudi embassy in Tehran. The attack was in reaction to Saudi Arabia's execution of 47 prisoners, including a prominent Saudi Shia cleric, Sheikh Nimr al-Nimr. Iraq's then Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi had also condemned the executions. "I'm shocked and saddened at Sheikh Nimr's execution by Saudi authorities," he wrote on Twitter. "Peaceful opposition is a fundamental right. Repression does not last," unquote. Let's dive right into our discussion of the whys and wherefore of this reach out. I'm joined by Abdulaziz Alghashian, lecturer of politics at the University of Essex, and Syed Mostapha Khoshcheshm, a journalist and analyst who has taught at a number of Iranian universities and academic centers and joins me from Tehran. Let me get to Mr. Alghashian here. Mr. Alghashian, what has caused this change of heart, if you will? Does it have anything to do with the change of U.S. administration, less influence of the Crown Prince in the White House, or do we have other factors leading to these talks and this process?
Well, first I'd like to say it's good to be with you here today, and greetings to you, to your guests, and all your viewers, and Eid Mubarak, inshallah. Indeed, I think what was very interesting is the fact that indeed Saudi Arabia does sense that the question in Saudi Arabia is not whether or not there will be a new nuclear deal between the United States and Iran. The question is when will it take place and when will it be reached? And I think Saudi Arabia is adapting to a new dynamic that's not very old, but a more traditional dynamic of the international relations of the Middle East. And therefore, it is very much adopting to a new order that might be ensuing probably very soon. Now, in this regard, I think traditionally, Saudi Arabia and Iran, contrary to what many people think, have not been completely against rapprochement with each other. There have always been times where they have extended their hands to each other. However, the question was on which conditions and what pretext would this be? So the desire to patch things up, or to desire to at least have a more cordial relationship, has always been there. But nevertheless, I think Saudi Arabia understands from its previous experiences that while it may be good to extend the hands of friendship and try to promote good neighborliness, and this is something that they always say, I think they do it very hesitantly because they have been let down by, this is what they believe, they have been let down before. They have seen maneuvers and aggression and policies, regional policies by Iran that for Saudi Arabia did not seem to lend itself to good neighborliness. So therefore, while there is an attempt to adopt or to adapt to a new situation, there is still some way to go, and there is still, their guard is still up.
Right. It's interesting that you said, because you basically said what Mr. Crimley said about verifiable deeds. Now, 2 points that you've made. One, of course, the imperative for Saudi Arabia to sort of understand the new regional dynamics and therefore to respond to that accordingly. And then, of course, the fact that since Riyadh thinks or perceives that it's been let down before, that it needs to be cautious and not let its guard down. So given that, so the imperative of understanding the new dynamics and the imperative of verifiable deeds. So there's a discrepancy, if you will, between these two. How would Riyadh square these?
Just like how this is a reaction, or this is an adaptation to a new dynamic, I think these rapprochement will come based upon how Saudi Arabia perceives any change in Iranian behavior. So if it perceives or if it sees any reason to increase rapprochement, that is the game changer. I think, and that's what's going to perpetuate this relationship to a more cordial relationship. So, and I think that's what the crux of the statement was. The crux of the statement was that, okay, we've been here before. We're not against trying to develop and improve relations. Rather, we have to see action, and we have to see less interference in Arab affairs. We have to see a de-escalation of hostile rhetoric. We have to see a lack of revolutionary rhetoric that calls for the toppling of monarchies, et cetera, et cetera. And I think once that begins to become clear, this is when the relations can take a step forward, and a hesitant step forward, but nevertheless a step forward.
Right. It's a pretty order, if you ask me, but let me pull in Sayyid Mostapha Khoshcheshm. So Mostapha, Abdulaziz Alghashian has talked about the fact that, Saudi Arabia needs a rapprochement, but there are also certain verifiable actions that Tehran has to undertake in order for Saudi Arabia to, for this reach out to become meaningful. So give me your sense of how Tehran looks at this reach out and how Tehran would want this to pan out.
Tehran has offered good relations and rapprochement with Saudi Arabia and those that are following the Saudis' suit. Several times there have been more than 4 or 5 major offers by Tehran, including the Hormuz Peace Initiative, in order to mend ties and settle the differences with the Saudis, but they have always shunned Iran's offers, and there is a reason for that. Let's see the backdrop against which this latest round of talks, has started. Back in 2013, in fall 2013, when Iran, the United States, and EU were striking a deal before the Geneva Interim Accord. It's written actually in John Kerry's book and Mohammad Javad Zarif's, memories, that he was recalling these memories just weeks ago, that a plane carrying Saudi rulers arrived in Switzerland, and John Kerry, rushed to the airport, as well as top U.S. Secretary Department officials. They rushed to the airport. Kerry was not Secretary of State then, but he was attending the talks. And they went for a meeting with the Saudis, who told the Americans, stop this accord with Iran. That's fall 2013, before the Geneva Interim Accord. If you stop, we will help you with oil prices. We will increase product to lower the prices. and then you will have better conditions for a deal with Iran. So the Saudis started the latest round of animosity in there. There have always been hostility towards Iran by the Saudis even before that, for the last several centuries. Actually, under the former regime of Pahlavi, there were not very good ties between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Regional dynamics are changing, as my friend said, with Biden in office. He is not for any kind of war or tension with Iran. He wants to, change the dynamics in the region, and he wants to leave this region, actually. The withdrawal from Afghanistan will be followed by other, pullouts in this region. And the Saudis are now feeling that they need to mend ties with Iran. Normalization of ties with Israel would invite more tensions to this region. Israelis are very much interested in projecting tensions from inside the occupied territories to the Persian Gulf through this normalized ties. So they need now to move away from, this rapprochement with Israel, and they should try to mend ties with Iran in order to stay immune in this new order that's appearing in the region.
Okay. I take this back to Alghashian very quickly before I wrap up. Abdulaziz, Alghashian, Mostapha, Khoshcheshm, basically the Iranians are saying that you need to lower your expectations. And that seems to suggest for Riyadh to understand that Iran has a stake in the greater Middle East, and whatever it has gained so far is something that Iran will only consolidate and not let go of. So is that something that would be acceptable to Riyadh?
So the hostility, then I don't want to go down that road because it's not productive and it's not fruitful discussions. But what I do want to say is that I want to demonstrate that what my colleague Mostapha has said is that he actually encapsulated what Saudi Arabia perhaps finds it difficult, is that indeed there is, Iran did extend its hand in friendship, but as long as Iran is the dominant factor in the region, as long as Iran is the dominant player in the region. And I think that's the whole point of the matter, is that, I don't want to go into who projected who first and who attacked who first, because it's just futile. I don't want to. I want to have constructive debate and constructive discussion. But while there is some truth to the fact that yes, Iran does want to have good relations with Saudi Arabia, indeed, but under which conditions? It's all about conditions. It's all about particular realities that could incentivize or dictate better relationship between Riyadh and Tehran or worsening relationships. So if Iran wants to be part of the broader Middle East, where it has a much bigger say in inside Arab affairs, that is going to be more that's going to be far more for the Iranian government, then it's something that I think will have resistance within Saudi Arabia. And there's one last thing about this aspect of normalization. I've been researching about Saudi Arabian Israeli normalization for the past 9 years. That was my research. And I could say that unfortunately, one of the aspects that perpetuate this misunderstanding of the imminency of Saudi-Israeli normalization has come from Iranian sources who have always considered Saudi Arabia and Israel to be imminently close and to be very, very, very close to normalizing relations, when the reality is not that. This is a very, very distant understanding of Saudi-Israeli relations and international relations in the Middle East. Why? Because it's very easy to galvanize support in that way. So I don't want to go into that route. I just think it's all about the realities that will take place in the ground in the Middle East, and that is what's going to dictate the level of rapprochement between Riyadh and Tehran.
We understand Saudi Arabia's concern about Iran encircling it. depriving it of its leadership role in the Arab world. But since I'm also running out of time, Mostapha Khoshcheshm, final word, but very quickly about what Abdulaziz Alghashian is saying with reference to Tehran's, quote unquote, the implication is meddling in Arab affairs.
That's the problem, Hijaz. Thank you for raising the note that Iran, according to Saudi Arabia, Iran is already dominant in many Arab capitals. And still, the Saudis, like my friend, they are saying that Iran is not a major actor, and if it wants to be a part of the regional politics, like in the Arab world, it needs to do this or that. Nobody is going to dictate anything to Tehran. That's the first thing. Second point is that Iran is already a major actor.
Okay, great. I have actually not just run out of time, but I've run over time. But it was such a fascinating discussion, and I suspect that we'll have more of it. It's great to have Abdulaziz Alghashian. It's his first appearance on this program, and I hope that we'll be able to get him once again. Thank you also to Mostapha Khoshcheshm, as always, happy Eid Mubarak to both of you. This is all from In Focus this week. We shall see you next Monday at the same time. Keep following our latest updates on social media at indus.news. Meanwhile, happy Eid al-Fitr to all our viewers. Given the COVID-19 threat, please stay safe and follow the non-vaccine safety protocols while you celebrate. Good night and goodbye.